Hello, we welcome you to the program today. If you would, please turn to your Bibles in Esther chapter 10. The plan today is to finish up the chapter and conclude with a brief discussion of providence in the Book of Esther. So if you will, please turn to Esther chapter 10. This is a very short chapter, and so a chapter of only 3 verses. Esther chapter 10, verses 1 to 3, we see Mordecai's advancement. Verse 1, and King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. This brief chapter closes with the greatness of Mordecai. Verse 1, we see that the author of the book, in order to show the greatness of Mordecai, first showed the power and might of King Ahasuerus. The king imposed tribute throughout his kingdom, on land, even to the islands of the sea. This word tribute may also be translated as tax. The people served under the king. King Ahasuerus reigned over 127 provinces, which extended from India to Ethiopia. We see this in Esther chapter 8 and verse 9. The term tribute here describes the power of King Ahasuerus and how he imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. People served under him. Verse 2. Now all the acts of his power and his might, and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? The author of the book of Esther notes that the acts of the power and might of King Ahasuerus were written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings. Likewise, the account of the greatness of Mordecai, too, was written, being noted right along with the record of the kings of Media and Persia. The king advanced Mordecai. The same term is also translated promoted in Esther chapter 3 and verse 1, and also chapter 5 and verse 11. The king made Mordecai great in his kingdom. Verse 3. For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all his countrymen. Mordecai the Jew was advanced by the king to be second to King Ahasuerus. Mordecai was also said to be great among the Jews. He was well received. That is, he was favored or in favor. He was popular. He was held in high esteem by his people. One of the reasons why the people accepted him was that he sought their good. He also spoke peace for his countrymen. He spoke for the welfare of his people, including those who would be his descendants or be their descendants. When Mordecai became great, he did not forget his people. Sometimes when people become great, they forget others. However, Mordecai was not like that. He remembered the needs of his brethren, his people. The term translated countrymen is literally seed. And so it may also be translated as those of Jewish descent, like we see in Esther 6 and 13, or descendants. Esther 9, 27, 28, Esther 9 and 31. And so this could refer not only to Mordecai, if he had descendants, but also to the descendants of his countrymen. And so he says, speaking peace to all his countrymen, or to all his seed, to all of those descendants. Well, that brings us to the end of the chapter. Like I said, it was a short chapter, only 3 verses, meant to show the greatness of Mordecai, beginning by showing the greatness of King Ahasuerus and how that Mordecai was second to him. Before we close today, let's look briefly at divine providence in the book of Esther. The name of God, you might have noticed, is not found in the book of Esther. However, just because the name God or Lord is not found in the book of Esther does not mean that God is not present. There's plenty of evidence to show that God is present in the book, that God was present with his people. The topic of divine providence addresses the foresight or provision of God. We might ask the question, in what way does God provide for his people? Note the similarities of the words: providence, provide, foresight. And so the idea of providence or providing for someone, the idea of foresight, of seeing ahead. In this book, we see the divine providence, God's foresight, and him providing for his people, God working behind the scenes. God is said to work providentially today. Before we look at a couple key passages, let's begin by noting a brief overview of some of the passages of the book. We begin the first chapter, the book of Esther, with Queen Vashti. Queen Vashti is summoned to the banquet. However, she refused to come to the feast before the king. The king was merry with wine, and in order to show the beauty of his queen to the people, we see that he called for her to come. However, she refused to come. And hearing counsel, the king agreed that the royal decree go out that as law, the royal privileges and position of the queen of Vashti be given to another. And so we see that Esther, along with others, were called. We note that there was a man named Mordecai who lived in Shushan, who raised his cousin Esther as his own daughter in Esther chapter 2, verses 5 to 7. Esther, along with other young women, were taken to the king's palace. And we see that with the king ultimately making Esther queen. Mordecai had told Esther not to reveal her people to others in Esther 2, 19 to 20. It happened that Mordecai foiled a plot to kill the king, which was not rewarded at the time because of some oversight. We saw in Esther 2, 21 to 23. Haman conspired against the Jews because of his hate for Mordecai in Esther 3. And Mordecai learned of the decree of Haman, and he mourned the decree to destroy the people in Esther 4, 1 to 3. Mordecai sent messages to Esther to persuade her to go before the king in Esther chapter 4, 4 to 14. Well, that brings us to a passage that I like to spend a little time on today. And we may be familiar with these words. Certainly we have from our study, but even before our study today. For such a time as this. Esther chapter 4, 13 to 14. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Mordecai was confident that relief and deliverance would come for the Jews. While he does not mention the name of God, It is evident that he trusted in God, who would provide relief and deliverance for the people. There are some indications of his faith in the book of Esther. With Mordecai and in Esther and his fellow Jews, we see that there was the custom of putting on sackcloth and ashes, fasting, weeping, and wailing. Esther chapter 4, 1-4. Esther asked Mordecai and the other Jews in Shushan to fast for her, and that she would fast before the dangerous mission of going before the king unsummoned. We note that in the Bible that fasting is accompanied, that prayer is accompanied by fasting. Did Mordecai pray to God? Yes, he did. And while the book itself does not mention prayer per se, it is implied in the custom of fasting. We see that prayer accompanied fasting. We learn this in the book of Daniel. We see here that Mordecai exhorted Esther to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people in Esther 4 and verse 8. He knew that she was in a position, being queen in the palace, to speak on behalf of her people, the Jews. Mordecai thought that God might work through Esther in order to deliver the Jews, his people. He suggested that this might be the reason that she was in the palace. He trusted in divine providence. As you continue to read the book of Esther, you note in Esther 4, 15-17, how Esther called for Mordecai and her fellow Jews to fast for her. We might say, pray for her. Yes, it's implied that they did pray. And if they did pray, who did they pray to? They prayed to God. While God's name is not mentioned, we see God is present. On the third day, Esther went before the king and prepared a banquet for the king and for Haman in Esther 5, 1-8. And we see how Haman plotted to hang Mordecai in Esther 5, 9-14. Well, let's look at a second passage. In this passage, we see that the king could not sleep. In Esther chapter 6, verse 1, that night the king could not sleep, so he commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Verse 3, he continues, then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. So the king said, who is in the court? Now, Haman had just entered the court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that had been prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, Haman is there, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So that night, the king could not sleep. And when he could not sleep, he had the book of records read to him, in which he learned about Mordecai and how he foiled a plot to kill him, to kill the king, in Esther 6, 1-3. And it happened that Haman just entered the court of the king to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had made for him. It just happened, right? Was this coincidence? Someone may read how the king was told of Mordecai and how Haman had just entered the court and may see this as something that happened that was unplanned, coincidence. However, when it comes to the book of Esther, there are a chain of events with each of these people, which are intricately connected and which lead to the deliverance of the Jews. It's incredible to imagine how that all of these things could have happened by coincidence that they could be accidents, that they could have been unplanned, even though they might appear to be planned, that they really were not planned at all. That's hard to believe. That's hard to accept. But as you read the book and you see the connection between each of the people, you see the providence of God. You see that there is planning going on behind the scenes. Now, Mordecai did not always know what it was. He thought perhaps, back up to the passage in Esther chapter 4, 13 to 14, what did he say? Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And so he wasn't certain. He did believe that God would deliver them. He didn't know exactly how, but he thought perhaps God would deliver them through Esther. Hence the name of the book. We see her as the main character of the book. We see her and God's plan to deliver the people. He said, yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? He did not know, but he did trust in God. And he knew that if it was the will of God, then certainly such could be done. Now here we see that night it happened. The king could not sleep. And so we recognize that a coincidence is a situation in which things happen. They happen at the same time without planning. Again, however, it's incredible to imagine that all these events happened by accident. And again, while God is not mentioned by name, the implication in the book of Esther is the providence of God. You think about the providence of God today. How does God work today? God works providentially. God working behind the scenes. We see God's wisdom in his foresight, his providence. Again, we continue with the book, and we see how Haman honored Mordecai. Now, unwittingly, he suggested the way in which Mordecai should be honored in Esther chapter 6, 5 to 11. We see how Esther made her petition before the king for her life and for the life of her people, and how she exposed the wicked Haman as the enemy, who the king had hanged on Haman's own gallows. We see how Haman had prepared for Mordecai in Esther 7. We see how Esther told the king how Mordecai was related to her, and he was permitted to come before the king in Esther chapter 8. We see how the king gave his signet ring, the ring he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai in Esther 8 and verse 2. We see how Esther spoke again to the king, imploring him to counteract the evil of Haman in Esther 8 and 3. And how the king permitted Esther and Mordecai to write a second decree concerning the Jews, and how Mordecai wrote permitting the Jews to protect themselves in Esther chapter 8 and verse 11. And how finally in Esther chapter 9, we see how the Jews overpowered their enemies. We look at the book, and as you read the book and you reread the book, and I would suggest that you do so, look for the providence of God. We look at these events through the eye of faith. We look in the scriptures. We have the benefit of the Holy Scriptures before us. But you put yourself in the shoes of Mordecai, Esther, and you ask, just how much did they know? Really, very little. But they trusted in God. And while they weren't sure exactly how God would deliver them, they trusted that God would. We see how Esther found the courage, and she fasted, and she asked people to fast for her, and she went before the king, even though it could be her life, but she went. She trusted in the providence of God, just as Mordecai did, as he told Esther, perhaps you've come to the palace for such a time as this. And we see from the benefit of the scriptures that she had come to the kingdom for that time, for just such a time. And so we see here in the book of Esther the providence of God. Now, there are other examples in the Bible of providence, and we could certainly look at others. But Let's just briefly note a couple before we dismiss today. Joseph. Remember Joseph in Genesis chapter 45 and 5? Remember Joseph who was sold into slavery by his brothers? Genesis 45 and verse 5 went down to Egypt. We see that his brothers went too for food, and we see that they came before Joseph. It says in Genesis 45 and 5, it says, "But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." We see in that passage how Joseph and his faith saw the providence of God in his life. In Genesis 50, verses 19 to 20, Joseph said to his brothers, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God?" He was not there to judge them for what they had done to him. "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." And so again, he's seen the providence of God. Now, with the book of Genesis, we have the benefit of seeing God's name. We have the benefit of seeing how that Joseph viewed these things. But we see just as well in the book of Esther the providence of God, even though the name God is not mentioned. We see their fasting. We see this practice of fasting for Esther, and we see God. One other example, Paul in the New Testament, in Philemon 1 and 15, there was a man who run away. And we see how Paul says, "For perhaps he departed for a while for this purpose, that you might receive him forever." Note the word perhaps. Perhaps. Even in that case, we see that the Apostle Paul was not certain, but he certainly believed it was possible that God could be working behind the scenes, that it may have been the will of God, that he might have been describing God's providence. Well, that's all the time that we have today. We've looked at the chapter, a very short chapter. It only took us a few minutes, but we've also taken the time to do a brief review of the book and also note a couple passages describing the providence of God. We hope that this has been beneficial to you today. Again, I would encourage you to, as you have time, to reread the book. And I think that one will be more and more impressed as one reads the book. But thank you for being here today. We look forward to seeing you again in the future, Lord willing.